Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. This video is about Australia Day because it is today, 26th of January, when I'm making this. So why does Australia Day fall on this particular date? Well, this is the day when in 1788 the first fleet arrived at Botany Bay and the first British settlers stepped ashore and founded Botany Bay Colony, soon to be New South Wales. Botany Bay, it's in what's now Sydney. So the Aborigines had been living in Australia for thousands of years by that stage, and they traded with the Indonesians, although of course the Indonesians were not Indonesian at the time. It's only when the Dutch conquered them and put it all together it became Indonesia, but how else would I say it? And anyway, then Occidental explorers had been sailing around Southeast Asia and had sighted the coast of Australia, Dutch and French explorers in particular. And there was Abel Tasman in the 17th century, a seaman from the Netherlands who sailed around that area. That's why there's there's Tasmania, that island, Australian state, Van Diemen's Land, they called it briefly, or that's why there's the Tasman Sea in between Australia and New Zealand. I know they're often mentioned in a breath, Australia, New Zealand, talking about their trans-Tasman cousins or whatever it is, and say, oh, well, they're so close. It's still like about 1,500 kilometres, but because Australia is such a gigantic country and New Zealand is not near any other landmass, people think that they're very close. They're actually not that close. Anyway, so Captain James Cook in the 1770s and the 1780s was sailing around there. He'd circumnavigated Australia. I believe he was the first person to do so. So what do they call this country? They were thinking of calling it, saying Terra Australis Incognita, which is Latin for the southern unknown land. And it wasn't until Matthew Flinders, I think it's in the early 19th century, that Matthew Flinders, that British explorer, I think he was a Royal Naval officer, that he popularised the term Australia. He wasn't one to invent it. By a curious coincidence, his grave has finally been located under Euston Station in London. There was a huge cemetery that was built over in the 19th century, and they found his grave because they're building a high-speed rail line through there, and they're going through all this, and the archaeologists are elated that to their surprise, they managed to identify his coffin because it's got his name and his date of death on it and blah, blah, blah. So the big statue of Matthew Flinders there in that station. And he's very associated with Adelaide, or is it Melbourne? Anyway, I think it's Adelaide. So next thing, so what about to do about Australia? Well, the British were concerned that the French would grab it. There was a lot of imperial rivalry there. Remember, the American Revolution was not long over, and France had declared war on the United Kingdom at the time. The Dutch had Java, that's the most populated island in Indonesia, were expanding the area. The Portuguese had East Timor, so Europeans were rapidly acquiring real estate in that portion of the world. So Captain Cook had bumped into the Great Barrier Reef sometime before. He sailed around New Zealand, of course, as well as the Cook Strait and Mount Cook and all that, the Cook Islands, and he'd been killed, cooked, and eaten. Cook was cooked in Hawaii in 1788 as well, if memory serves. But anyway, it was a different British sea captain who led people from the United Kingdom. They sailed all the way to Australia. America had been a dumping ground for British criminals until the Revolution. They'd been sent to some of the southern colonies. Now, obviously, some of the Britons who'd emigrated to America had gone as free settlers, but a minority of them were malfeasants who were sentenced to transportation. And as America was closed as an option, British judges began to dispatch people to Australia. As Niall Ferguson memorably said, it was like going to Mars. It was a very lengthy journey, 8 months. You may well not survive the journey. You might be dying of scurvy if you didn't get your lime juice. That's why Britishers are called limeys, to protect themselves from scurvy. That's a disease that people acquired from having a paucity of fresh fruit and vegetables. Weak gums and hair falling out and poor colour, and I can't remember the more serious conditions. Prisoners fighting, diseases on board. Well, you weren't going to get to hospital for months. For months, you might be attacked by pirates. Your ship might capsize in a storm. You might hit a reef, anything like that. So anyway, so lots of British miscreants and a few free settlers and Royal Marines were sent to Botany Bay, and they landed there on this day in 1788. They call it botany as in the study of plants. There are many plants that were not found elsewhere, and these British immigrants found that to be unutterably scintillating. Moreover, they found a platypus, this curious beast, and they obviously killed one, they preserved it in alcohol, I presume, and sent it back to Londinium. And the Royal Society was studying it, and they thought it was a joke. It was a hoax. Somebody's got a bit of a duck and a bit of a whatever, a mouse and whatever, and sewn it together and trying to convince us that such an animal exists. This animal is so bizarre, it couldn't possibly exist, but no, platypuses really do exist. Are they platypi? I don't know what the plural is. Because they're difficult to classify. According to Linnaeus' system, it's hard to decide which category they ought to fall into. They couldn't determine, is it a bird, or is it a mammal, or an amphibian, or a what? Because it doesn't quite behave like any other. Obviously, laying eggs, and is it warm-blooded, and I can't think it can breathe underwater, and all sorts of bizarre things. It's a very unique combination. So that was that. These British settlers were settling there. People could be sentenced to 14 years transportation or indeed 7 years transportation. It varied according to the severity of the crime. This was an era in which the death penalty was awarded promiscuously for something as petty as grand larceny. So grand larceny was stealing more than 12 pence. Someone could easily have more than 12 pence in their purse at a time. Incidentally, 12 pence was not quite as measly a sum as it is today. That was half a day's wage for a skilled craftsman, such as a carpenter or something like that. But anyway, and even children could be executed for stealing food if it was more than 12 pence worth. So rather than sentence people to hang, they're often sentenced to transportation. And they would go there and serve out their term, as I say, up to 14 years. They're usually released early, and the Royal Marines were guarding them. And then they often went on to be very respectable citizens. So Australians are often now proud to be descended from these people who were sent abroad for things as trifling as stealing bread. First fleeters, they're called, if they're descended from those who arrived on that first fleet. So Australia Day is celebrated. And the majority of immigrants to Australia were always those who had moved there freely. But and finally, in 1868, transportation to Australia was scrapped as a punishment. And other countries have used this banishment and imprisonment, this penal servitude overseas as a penalty, like France sent people to Devil's Island in Guyana. Papillon, you may have read the novel or perhaps seen the Dustin Hoffman film. And the Britishers, they spread out and established more colonies around the coast of Australia, such as Queensland and Victoria. And New Zealand was, first of all, an extension of New South Wales, because Sydney is in the colony of New South Wales. So Botany Bay, just the bay, and then the city they established there, they called it Sydney after the Home Secretary, Lord Sydney, and another major city, Melbourne, after the Prime Minister, Viscount Melbourne, and so forth. So setting up various colonies. Not until 1900 that Australia was federated, that the several colonies of Australia were to be united. Prior to that, they were not politically connected to each other. All of them had a direct relationship with the United Kingdom. Queensland did, and South Australia did, and New South Wales did, and so on, but not with each other. 1900 said, okay, let's put them all together. We'll create this Dominion of Australia, or Commonwealth of Australia, I should say. So Commonwealth is another word for a polity that's got a monarch in this case. So Australia will be internally self-governing. All the states will have their own legislature and run their own affairs internally to some extent, but cooperate on certain issues together, have their own capital city. And that to decide where that was going to be, there's a very healthy rivalry between Melbourne and Sydney. Sydney's a bit larger, the first one founded, and eventually they struck a compromise. They would build a new purpose-built capital in between them, Canberra. Actually, it's rather closer to Sydney than it is to Melbourne. Well, that is Australia, one of the major Anglophone countries. Obviously, still got the Union flag in the ensign of its flag, and still has Elizabeth II as its head of state. And Australia is no longer so closely connected to the United Kingdom. People often say it's an Asia-Pacific country, and the time was that almost every Australian was of British stock, but that's not the case. Obviously, through the 19th century, Danish and German immigrants came in the 20th century. It varied. People from what's now Serbia and Croatia started to move in significant numbers. And likewise, people from Asian countries had a white Australia policy until the 1970s, but they say now we will obviously welcome good people from all over the world. There are Chinese Australians, Indian Australians, Vietnamese Australians, I could go on. South African Australians, Lebanese Australians, and on and on. So that is Australia today, which is country's got a very high standard of living and a really good quality of life, I think. It's quite like Ireland and Great Britain, except with much better weather. Same fixation on sport. I remember around the bicentenary of Australia, 1988, it was the height of fashion in the British Isles, all things Australian. That's when Neighbours had just started. And presenting it as a proletarian paradise, even people with a not very well paid job could have a handsome and spacious house with a swimming pool and a large garden, all the rest of it. And they really only did work 8 hours a day, could easily go to the beach and could easily play sport outside every afternoon. So Australia, it's a highly attractive place to live. Well, I shan't bang on about it all day. That is Australia Day, the National Day of Australia.